Welcome to Back to the Bible. Today we have another life-transforming study from God's Word with Bible teacher Bryan Clark. Today's study on the life of Noah will show you what it means to live in faith, even during times of waiting. Later in the program, Bryan will join Arnie and Kara in studio to discuss how to live that out in meaningful ways. Now here's Bryan Clark with today's study.
The reality is, even though we put our faith in God and we are living out our salvation on this earth, sometimes we face tragedies and we are asked to wait upon God. But sometimes in those times of waiting, it seems like God is so far away. It seems like God doesn't really hear our prayers. As a matter of fact, sometimes it feels like God doesn't really even care. C.S. Lewis puts feelings into words when he writes, "Meanwhile, where is God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms. When you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing Him, if you turn to Him with praise, your praise will be welcomed with open arms. But go to Him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. You may as well turn away." Many of us have felt those moments when in that hour of need we cry out to God and it just doesn't feel like He's there. You can almost hear the doors slamming and the locks locked from the inside, and we wonder, where is God in all of that? And we wonder, why does it have to be that way? I have found that those trials that come and are very intense and they kind of knock the wind out of us, but they come and they go fairly quickly. Those are much easier to deal with compared to those that linger week after week, month after month, often year after year. And those are the ones that stretch our faith. Those are the ones that cause us to cry out and ask, God, where are you? I don't know of anything more difficult than waiting on God. And that's why I'm so impressed with the faith and obedience of Noah. Because Noah modeled what it means to wait upon God. For 120 years, Noah built an ark on dry ground, believing that God promised He would send judgment, and that promise was true. And there must have been days where Noah really wondered if it was all worth it, and he wondered what this was all about, and his faith must have grown thin. But Noah believed God, and for 120 years he labored to build that ark. And then came the day when they entered the ark by faith, and they waited for the rain, and the rain began to fall. And Noah and his family lived on that ark in probably virtual darkness. There was only one window, and outside it was dark from the storm and the clouds for 1 year and 10 days. Can you imagine what that would be like? There was no indication in the scriptures that God said a word to Noah from the day they entered the ark until 1 year and 10 days later when it was time to exit the ark. And one can only imagine what feelings went on in the heart of Noah and his family as their faith was stretched to its limit, as they wondered, how will the world look when this is all over? And how will we survive? And will we survive? And how long will all this last? In the midst of all of that, there isn't a whole lot to do on the ark, but just to wait. And for 1 year and 10 days in that dark place, knowing that outside of the ark, every living creature is perishing, and Noah waited. And as I read through Genesis chapter 8, I find a great emphasis on this whole concept of waiting. The way that this text is written forces us to slow down and go through the details of the waiting to the point where it almost becomes monotonous. It almost becomes irritating as we have so much trouble getting Noah off of this ark. And we identify with our own feelings of waiting upon God and wondering why it has to just keep lingering out longer and longer and longer. So I would invite you to turn with me to Genesis chapter 8 as we learn something about what it means to wait upon God. Genesis chapter 8, verse 1 opens with the words, "But God remembered Noah." That's a great line. The text had been telling us in the previous chapter about the flood and God's judgment being poured out on the world. But in the midst of that, there is a reminder that God remembered Noah. Now, this word remembered does not mean that God had forgotten Noah and suddenly remembered him. Hey, wasn't there some guy in an ark down there? I wonder where he's floated off to. And God had to go find Noah somewhere. That isn't the Hebrew word. It's a word that means to fulfill a promise. That God remembered Noah in the sense that he was fully intent on fulfilling the promise he had made to Noah. He was going to complete his salvation. He was going to get him through this to the new beginning as God had promised. But it's interesting to notice that even though God remembered Noah, Noah had no way of knowing that other than by faith, trusting that God would be faithful to his promise. There's no indication in the text at all that God said anything to Noah for 1 year and 10 days. And Noah didn't know how long this thing was going to last. He didn't know what it would look like. He just was told to get on the ark, and he waited until God told him to get off the ark. So you have that experience that we so often can identify with, that God is very aware of our circumstances, and God is remembering us, and God is at work for us, but we have to take that by faith. Because we have nothing to indicate that other than walking by faith and believing that that is true, as Noah did. But God remembered Noah, and all the beasts and all the cattle were with him in the ark. And God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. The idea of the wind passing over the earth takes us back to Genesis chapter 1. We'll find a number of phrases in this text that take us back to Genesis 1 as if God is saying this is a new beginning. This is a recreation. God is starting over. Remember, we talked about in Genesis 1 that the Hebrew word for spirit and the Hebrew word for wind is the same word. And in Genesis 1, in verses 2 and 3, it talks about the wind or the Spirit of God hovering over the waters of the deep as this process of creation was beginning. And now that's the same language that's used here. The wind or the Spirit of God, whichever you like, is going over the waters and beginning to dry them out as God is recreating the earth, in a sense, for the second time. And the fountains of the deep and the floodgates of the sky were closed, and the rain from the sky was restrained, and the water receded steadily from the earth. And at the end of 150 days, the water decreased. And in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat. We learned several things in verse 4. Number one, we get some sort of a time frame. We were told in Genesis chapter 7 that it was in the 2nd month, on the 17th day, that Noah and his family entered the ark. So now we're in the 7th month, 17th day. So it's been 5 months that Noah has been on the ark. And that would be long enough for anybody to go stir crazy down in a dark hole with all of those animals, with nothing to do, with just your family and the storm outside. So for 5 months, they have been floating around, and finally they come to rest on Ararat. But there's also significance to the 7th month and the 17th day. If you study the Hebrew calendar, you find that God established that in the 7th month, on the 14th day, was the Day of Atonement. It was the day when the sacrifice would be made for the sins of the people, and it was merely a shadow of a day when Jesus, the Lamb of God, would come to take away the sin of the world. And so there was a picture in that of the salvation to come. We know then in the New Testament that Jesus was crucified in the 7th month on the 14th day. And that was the ultimate Day of Atonement, the fulfillment of that picture. If that is true, then, he was crucified on the 14th day, 15th, 16th, risen on the 17th day. So the day that the ark landed on or rested on Ararat is symbolic of the salvation that has been provided being completed. In a sense, the ark was now resting, the judgment had come to pass, and the waters were receding. And it's all symbolic of the greater salvation to come that would be provided through Jesus, the promised Messiah. Also notice that the text says that the ark didn't dock on Ararat. It didn't land on Ararat. It rested. And we've talked a lot about this word rest. Started in Genesis 2 verse 1, where it talked about we enter into the Sabbath rest of God. And that is experiencing the grace of God, what God has done for us, and that's a picture of our salvation. And so the wording is carefully chosen here, again, to be symbolic of a salvation to come, that the ark had rested on this wonderful day, the 7th month, the 17th day.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, visit backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Our study continues now in Genesis chapter 8. Here again is Bryan Clark.
We kind of get the impression from verse 4 that because the ark had come to a rest, that it's about time for Noah and his family to get off the ark. Little do we realize that they aren't even close to getting off the ark at this point. Verse 5, and the water decreased steadily until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains became visible. So now we've gone 2.5 months from when they rested on Ararat, and now the tops of the mountains are visible, and we're kind of getting this feeling, okay, that's probably enough. They can come out and they can dwell on the top of the mountain for a while. Let these poor people out of that boat before they go crazy in there. But they aren't even close to getting out. Verse 6, then it came about at the end of 40 days. So now we've gone almost another month and a half from that before the next episode takes place. At the end of 40 days that Noah opened the door of the ark, which he had made, and he sent out a raven. And it flew here and there until the water was dried up from the earth. And then he sent out a dove from him to see if the water was abated from the face of the land. But the dove found no resting place for the sole of her foot. So she returned to him into the ark, for the water was on the surface of all the earth. Then he put out his hand and took her and brought her into the ark to himself. 40 days pass, and Noah releases this raven. A raven was considered an unclean bird. We find out that later in the law. And perhaps it was this idea that this unclean bird was released and he could land on the floating carcasses, and he was carnivorous. He would pick from the floating carcasses and he would survive just fine out there. And maybe he represents those who are unclean, who would leave and never return to God. And maybe the dove represents those who return to God, who are considered to be clean. But you got to know, that's my best guess. I really don't know what it means. But the dove, we understand, Noah is releasing to see whether or not the dove can find a place to live, and if it can't, he knows that it will return. And what comes back is this dove saying that, nope, the waters have not receded, you have to stay on the ark. Now, this has already been a long time since they came to rest on Ararat, and now they're going to wait a little bit longer. Verse 10, so he waited yet another 7 days, and again he sent out the dove from the ark. And the dove came to him toward evening, and behold, in her beak was a freshly picked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the water was abated from the earth. This is kind of a worldwide symbol for peace. You see the turtle dove with an olive branch in its mouth. But for Noah, it simply meant that the waters had receded enough that the dove had found this, and it gave Noah a sense of hope that the water was going down, and soon they would be able to exit the ark and get on with their lives. I have found that in these times of waiting, when it just seems like the days linger and days turn into weeks, turn into months, that God is faithful to give us little reminders of His faithfulness, little reminders that He is there and that He is remembering us, and it's all going to work out if we just trust Him. And that's what God gave to Noah. It was just enough to strengthen Noah's faith that he might wait upon God. And so the dove comes back with that olive branch in his mouth. Verse 12, then he waited yet another 7 days, and he sent out the dove, but she did not return to him again. So now we get this feeling, okay, the dove landed out there, everything's okay, let's get these folks out of that ark. Verse 13, now it came about in the 601st year, in the first month, on the first of the month, The water was dried up from the earth. Then Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the surface of the ground was dried up. And we say, finally, what a painful passage, trying to get this family out of this dark barge and onto the earth again. Now they've sat there waiting to get out all the way to the first month, first day, and he takes the top off, he looks outside, everything's dried up, everything within him must have wanted to jump out of the ark and get out of there. You just kind of imagine how they were responding and interacting with one another. They've been in that dark ark for such a long time, they were probably getting on everyone's nerves, and we feel like in this verse, finally, let's get those people out of that ship. But it's not time yet. It's not time yet. Verse 14, and in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. Then God spoke to Noah. And we say, man, finally, 57 days after he took the top off and saw that the ground was dry, in his thinking it must have been fine for him to get out of the ark. But it was 57 days later that God finally came and said, okay, Noah, time to get off the ark. Can you imagine the conversations over those 57 days? You know, come on, Dad, the ground is dry, everything's fine, let's go. And imagine for 56 days, they're just in this waiting pattern. They've been on this goofy boat for 1 year and 10 days. And finally, on the 57th day, after the top is off the ark, God finally speaks and says, okay, it's time to go. I mean, Noah was an incredible man of faith, patiently waiting for God to tell him when it was time to leave. Verse 15, then God spoke to Noah, saying, go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all the flesh that is with you, birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may breed abundantly on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. Another phrase that takes us back to Genesis 1, be fruitful, multiply. We're starting over, really is the feeling there. Verse 18, so Noah went out, and his sons and his wives and his sons' wives with him. Every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out by their families from the ark. There's a couple questions that arise when I read through this text. As a matter of fact, it almost gets kind of irritating. All these months and days, and the thing just seems to linger, and I found myself trying to keep track of this month and this day, and then this month and this day. You kind of get the feeling, man, get these folks out of the ark. I don't need to know all this detail. And you ask yourself, why, God? Why put all this in there? And I think there's a couple of reasons. One reason is because it reminds us this was a historical event. Legends and stories don't have all these details, this month and this day. But it's a way of saying this was an actual event, and these were the days, and these were the months. But more than that, it's a Hebrew technique that slows the passage way down to the point where it's almost painful. It's almost irritating that it just kind of bogs down. But it bogs down in the sense that we keep thinking Noah's about ready to get off the ark, and it just keeps lingering on and on and on. And in a sense, that is the point. The point is God is saying, this is my example in Noah of what I want from my people. That's what God has provided throughout this story, that Noah was a righteous man, and Noah walked by faith. And walking by faith meant he was willing to wait for me. And so for 1 year and 10 days, Noah just waits. And even when the top is off and the ground is dry and everything looks fine to exit the ark, Noah waited in obedience till God said, okay, Noah, time to get off the ark.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, visit backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Now Bryan Clark joins us in the studio with Back to the Bible CEO Arnie Cole and author Kara Whitney.
Bryan, as you know, I'm always in a hurry and I hate waiting. But you see Noah working, waiting, and waiting. Even though it looked like it was time to get off the ark, he still waited. Why is that so important?
Yeah, so I love the way these Hebrew narratives are written There's just so much skill written into these narratives. So in this particular one, this emphasis on waiting and waiting, 120 years to get in the ark, and then so much waiting to get off the ark. I think in so many of these biblical stories, we lose track of the time lapse, and we forget how much time is spent just waiting on God. I don't like to wait. I don't think anybody does.
Right.
But I think what happens in those moments is I'm forced to remember I'm not God. I can't always fix this or make it right or change this. And sometimes the waiting's necessary for me to recalibrate. If we go back to Genesis 3, the problem I'm always wrestling with is the risk of being made in the image of God is to think I can be God. And waiting forces me to come to grips with my humanness and my need for God, and at times just to wait for Him.
Right. So me saying, Lord, please help me give up caffeine, and then saying, Lord, if you want me to have a cup of coffee, make the drive-through open, and then circle the block 5 times.
Right.
Waiting for the drive-through to open
Right.
is really what I want.
Right. Just in case I didn't hear you right on the first time. Yeah, that can be challenging, especially in a culture where it's instant this, instant that. So it's God, tell me what you want, and I need it on my terms and my timetable. And you can almost imagine God just kind of sitting back and saying, you're just going to have to wait here a little bit. But I think, it's driven by principles. We're not going to get a writing in the sky or an audible voice. So there's biblical principles, and I try to understand what those are and do my best to do my part and trust God with His part. I think as long as the intent of my heart is really to be obedient, I want what God wants. I want to be obedient. The path may be a little zigzaggy, but God's going to get me where He wants me. I think the thing we're always assessing is, am I trying to use God to fulfill my agenda, or am I genuinely seeking, God, what do you want from me here?
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, visit backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Bryan Clark will be back again tomorrow with more timeless truths from the book of Genesis to help you grow in your relationship with God. So be sure to tune in here on Back to the Bible.